When I was a youngster, I built rockets.
Okay.
I was very interested in rockets, very interested in rocket flight. So much so that I actually wrote to Werner von Braun and got a letter back from him.
Wow.
I'm sure it was, a form letter, what I call the bug letter. Experimented with rockets at a young age. So about in early 2000, mid 2000s, 2008, 2009, I started reading about this guy, Elon Musk, that was building a rocket company. And then I discovered he was South African. And so I looked up SpaceX because I'd heard the name SpaceX, found their website, and found these incredible blog posts that Elon had written about how things were going. Each launch, not only each launch, but he would do a milestone, he'd do blog on a milestone basis. And they were beautifully written. I mean, they were fantastically well written. So, I like good writing. I'm an avid reader. And so I started following him. And then his blog post pointed me to his Tesla blog posts. And his Tesla blog posts were extremely interesting because he was struggling at that time with the management of Tesla. It was, he had started Tesla with a bunch of partners. He was providing the money. They were presumably supplying the management skills. And he was blogging about where they were in the development of the Roadster. And he started writing quite honestly and quite frankly about the problems that they were having with the engineering, actually the financial side of the building, because he was discovering the bill of materials was like 4 times the price that they were positing to sell this thing at. Anyway, long story short, that got me intrigued. And then, he started by throwing out his co-founders.
Right.
He brought in an Israeli CEO. He didn't last very long. And then ultimately, Elon took over the CEO-ship. And so I continued to follow both companies, SpaceX more avidly than Tesla, because I didn't see myself as a potential investor of Tesla until the Model S came out. And that Model S was a stunning revelation to me that they could move from I love the Roadster. It's kind of cogitating about buying the Roadster, but it was really difficult outside of California to buy a Roadster for a couple of reasons, one of which was charging. Obviously, you could only use it as a hobby car without a charging network. And then they announced the Model S, and then the company went public. And that was my first tip. And I've been accumulating ever since. And my conviction has been growing ever since, not because of the fantastic cars. They are fantastic. And, I've had, I think no, I haven't had a Model S. I've had, Model 3, because the charging network took a bit of time to get to the south here in North Carolina. Anyway, the bottom line is that's how I got to be intrigued by Elon Musk. And I will tell you the most interesting part of the story, and this gives you a sense of just how small South Africa is or was. My brother was friendly with Elon's dad.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, my elder brother is a consulting engineer, and he worked with me for a time in my business, and then he He went into he left and he was, I think, representing a technical manufacturing company. He's an engineer, and he called on Elon Musk's father, who was in practice in Pretoria at the time. And Elon Musk's father actually gave him some career advice. They became friendly, and he gave him some career advice about starting his own consulting business, which he did ultimately. I'm not clear on all the details of the story, but you know, I mean, we read some pretty horror stories about Elon's father, particularly in Walter Isaacson's book.
Right.
But Norman, my brother, liked Elon's father.
Okay. All right.
He saw the good side of the guy, not the crazy side of the guy.
I see. Okay.
Yeah. So that's the story.
I see. All right. Well, so now, so are you willing to divulge the cost of your first share that you bought?
I bought shares on the day of the IPO. You know, I want to say they were about $14 a share before all the splits.
Yeah.
In that range. You know, I'm not a detailed guy when it comes to share prices, as you probably know by now. You know, I buy on a strategic basis. So the actual dollar cost of the share is not that important. I mean, sometimes I trade in options and then every penny counts, but when I buy for the long term. So I think it was in the range of 14. There were purchases between $14 and $18, as I recall it.
And with all the splits and everything, that would put it under $1, I suppose.
I think there've been 5 splits, so that would be $3 to $5.
$3 to $5. Okay.
No, 5 splits. That would put it yeah, under $3 to $5 ish.
Okay. All right. Yeah. So interesting.
You know, there's a saying in South Africa, "Ek was ook gebore." I was also born. And I was born into a Jewish family, a middle-class Jewish family. My father was a doctor. He was the local town doctor.
Okay.
Our town was a mined out mining town, basically.
Mined out. Okay.
Mined out. I mean, the gold was exhausted. The coal was exhausted. You know, it was a railway town because so we were on the outskirts of Johannesburg. The center of Johannesburg was about 25 miles from where we were. So you must understand that Johannesburg sits on a reef, on a rise that runs east to west. It sits in the middle. That rise was actually the gold pushing up up from deep down. The gold is like a saucer, and that saucer had risen and pressed up this so-called reef. It was called the White Waters Reef, or Witwatersrand.
Okay.
That Witwatersrand ran east to west, and the eastern part of that saucer was where the original gold was discovered under Johannesburg, but the really rich initial gold was in the eastern part of the reef, and that's where Brakpan was, almost at the very periphery of the eastern rim. And so the mines really ran out in the 50s. I was born in 1946.
Right.
My father had been to war. He had volunteered. The South African Army was a volunteer army because the country was very split. The right wing, you know, what they call the Afrikaners, the right wing descendants of the Dutch, were very opposed to the war. They had aligned themselves with Hitler, many of them, not all of them by any manner of means, but the ruling party, not the ruling party, the party that represented them in parliament was very strongly right wing. And so the government under General Jan Smuts, who came from this Afrikaans background, who had fought the British in the Boer War, and who had actually captured Churchill. Interestingly enough, when Churchill was captured, Churchill was anyway. Smuts was very aligned with Britain, and he was in power. His party, which was kind of the left wing of the Afrikaners, plus many of the English-speaking, who were much further left, and by left I mean quite center, because left in South Africa did not mean anything like the left you can imagine of today. But they were very aligned with Britain. They threw their lot in with Britain in the World War, and they sent a volunteer army, a couple of divisions of men, up to the north of Africa, and they drove the Germans out of North Africa, and then proceeded on to Italy, where they, were mired down for years in terrible, terrible fighting. My father joined them. He joined them, and as they shipped out to Africa, he was married to my mother, just like the night before. He was given special dispensation to have a honeymoon, and so he wasn't with the main body of men. He actually was on a boat that kind of trailed the main body because his officer commanding gave him this honeymoon away. Anyway, he came back from the war pretty, I would say, a changed person. He'd gone away to the war, bon vivant, very happy-go-lucky. He was a medical doctor at that point. He had had a great, university time. He'd done a lot of stuff, but he came back from the war sobered, and I mean absolutely sober, never touched a drink after that in his life, throughout his life, and very serious. Didn't lack humor, but wasn't spontaneously humorous. And so he found it necessary to, settle in this backwater. In fact, Brakpan means backwater.
Oh, wow.
So literally a backwater. And so we were brought up in this home where, he was very disciplined and quiet, and it didn't suit me. And my father and I didn't see eye to eye until much later in life. And he lived with us in the last years of his life, and he and I were very, very close in those late years. But he came back, from a very tough war, a lot of stories about that. And so he settled in Brakpan. He was like the railway doctor, that he served all the people who worked for the railway. So railways were a big part of Brakpan life. It had been supporting the mines. He was also a mine doctor, but the mines were, as I said, thinning out. And he also was in charge of the tuberculosis hospital. We had a huge tuberculosis hospital, one of the largest in the world, over 5,000 people there, because a lot of, tuberculosis had infected a huge proportion of the population. So that was my early life, in this. And then at the age of 5, I developed this disease. Today, kids have it and they survive with it, and they just go to school and treat it in the normal way. In those days, you went to hospital, and I was in hospital for 2.5 years. They thought it was polio at first.
Wow.
You lose the use of your leg.
Wow.
Because the head of the femur, where the hip bone just kind of disintegrates, and so you have to. Anyway, in those days they put you in bed, and I was in bed for like 2.5 years at the age of between the ages of, I think, 6 and 8.5. And then I was in calipers. I was in irons for another 6 months, maybe even a year. And so I never played sports. I was hopeless, I was, just hopeless with sports. and still am. And that affected my childhood greatly, and probably my life, because I became a bookworm, and I even wrote books. I wrote these, I had these exercise books, and I would write these stories. Yeah, it was a different upbringing.
Yeah.
And what, it had a lot of impact on my life. So if you see that the Churchill books in my library, I read very deeply and became very interested in the history of the Second World War. The history of modern Europe from the 1870s to modern day, and so that was my upbringing. That's how and growing up in South Africa was very tough for a little Jewish boy, because firstly I was a runt, very short, very small, had a little bit of a limp, and so I was picked on by some of these young Afrikaans boys who had this antipathy towards Jews, and so I was the 𝐒𝐤𝐡, and it was rough. Okay. So that was it.